Let's talk about some epic heroes of the Space Marines, with an overview of some of the strongest named heroes in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about some Space Marine named characters, and for this video go through a rough top 8 of some of the characters that I think bring the most strength to their different armies. Obviously this one's definitely going to be a bit arbitrary, given that the different characters do really very different things for their different factions, and they don't really compete head to head. Maybe a bit more of an excuse to talk about some powerful named characters in game, and what sort of things they do when they're put on the tabletop. I've chosen to put 8 characters in the main list for this one, but then I'll go through a few other picks that I think might be honourable mentions, maybe not so very far behind. Jumping straight into it, in our list of epic heroes, first up we have the Emperor's Champion of the Black Templars. I guess compared with the rest of the named characters, he's a bit borderline, but given that he's an epic hero and you can only field one in the army, I have chosen to include him. And he just brings an enormous amount of very fighty melee to the table, and even more if you happen to pair him with Sword Brethren. Unlike most of the other characters, he doesn't really do anything for his squad, but for 75 points, being able to get 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3 with precision is absolutely brutal. Most normal sized weapons only get Damage 2 for characters of his kind of class, and also has the option to do a sweep mode as well, and then potentially if you pair him with Sword Brethren, then either of those attack modes can get a lot more dangerous, due to using their special rule in the fight phase. Each time they get to attack, they get to either add 1 to their attacks characteristic if they're fighting against hordes, or add 1 to the damage characteristic of their weapons. If you're fighting anything tough, then it's usually going to be the damage characteristic, so you could either have 12 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2, which is kind of mad for 75 points, or big 6 attacks that are landing at a huge Damage 4, and all of those with precision if it helps to snipe out enemy characters. If he does wind up losing his squad or getting precision attacks against him is at least fairly tough to take down, a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable, and the chance to blank a damage to 0, and even gets +1 to wound against enemy characters as a further buff against them, which could be really big if he happens to be fighting against, say, an Imperial Knight. 6 attacks with Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 4 is really not what they want to be having with +1 to wound rolls, and if you're using Righteous Crusaders you could also flex into lethal hits as well. Point for point, he's arguably one of the best combat brawl characters in the entire game, and he does seem to appear in more competitive Black Templar lists than not. Next up I chose to rank Logan Grimnar in 7th, perhaps primarily for his Storm Rider loadout, though his on-foot Terminator one is also pretty usable. On Storm Rider he can run with the Thunderwolves though, 180 points for one of the biggest and scariest mounted characters in the game, moving up alongside the Thunderwolves with a 10-inch move and some fairly decent toughness with 12 wounds with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. And he hits pretty hard in combat with kind of similar stats to the Emperor's Champion really, with the Axe Morkai, a sweep and a strike mode, though he does also get the flurry of teeth and claws with his Thunderwolves. Like the Sword Brethren for the Black Templars, being attached to a squad of Thunderwolves can also give him advantages. When they're on the charge you get +1 to your damage characteristic, so again he could be sweeping with a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks or damage 4 on strike. They're likely going to have lethal hits, as there's usually a battle leader in the unit, and if Logan does use those good stats to wipe out any enemy units, then you generate a command point, maybe not super guaranteed in any one game, but really not the hardest to achieve if he's going to be hitting the enemy hard. One of the biggest things that basically makes him overall worth it though is his High King of Fenris special rule, allowing you a big once per game reroll all charge rolls and reroll all hits in the fight phase, kind of massive if you're slamming into the enemy with multiple Thunderwolf units, maybe advancing and charging in the Space Wolf Stormlands. The overall offering seems to be enough to have him make the cut in really quite a lot of competitive Space Wolf lists, and they're doing fairly well on the tournament stats at the moment, at least in win percentage. He's certainly one of the more common special character includes for the Sons of Fenris. Next up, in 6th place, I chose to rank Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines. The captain of the 4th Company and his unorthodox tactics come for 75 points, and his big ability is allowing you to grant one other unit of infantry the deep strike keyword, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the one that he's leading. That just in itself is worth a good few points, and perhaps most commonly tends to get given to Devastator Centurions in the Vanguard detachment, allowing them to kind of disturbingly warp around the board, using the return to reserve stratagem to essentially be able to jump around and draw a bead on exactly what they want to each turn if they happen to be out of position. With a bunch of las cannons and missile launchers, they've got really quite scary damage output. Their big weakness is their speed and not being able to get targets where they want to, and that kind of solves that problem. They could be interesting for other things as well, say for example some fire discipline Hellblasters or similar in Gladius. or even delivering other close-range shooting threats like Eradicators if you wanted. In any case, I'd certainly value the granting deep strike as just worth a few points in itself, and then after you've accounted for that, he's basically just a solid enough melee brawler captain. 6 attacks at strength 6 and damage 2 with sustained hits 1 is quite nice for skirmishing against medium infantry. He often tends to get put with either company heroes or some assault intercessors, the company heroes being quite a nice midfield bully unit that takes some focused fire to bring down, or the assault intercessors basically giving him a very cheap bodyguard that could allow him to re-roll wound rolls when he targets things on objectives. Between all that, he does tend to make the cut in quite a lot of Ultramarines lists, just allows you to deploy one of your shooting units really quite reliably, and the overall value between his melee stats and that seem to justify the 75 points pretty well. Next up, and back to the Black Templars, we've got High Marshal Helbrecht. The Crusader-in-Chief will set you back 120 points, and at the current points cost he feels almost like an upgraded version of the Emperor's Champion in his own way. A kind of similar melee profile, but also brings far more in terms of buffs to his units. It might depend on exactly how much investment you want to put in the squad, but this guy with a unit of 10 Sword Brethren and a Castellan could pretty much body just about anything in the game all the way up to a Titan, just with average rolling in a single round of combat when you stack all the buffs high. Again, like the Emperor's Champion, he gets a sweep and strike mode that, if he goes with Sword Brethren, could acquire +1 damage, so you could have 12 attacks at strength 6, AP3 damage 2, or 6 at strength 8, AP3 damage 4. In reality, they'll be at strength 7 and strength 9 due to his Crusader Wrath special rule, which means that you add +1 to the strength characteristic, and the other part of that buffing rule means that critical hits go off on a 5+. Just for his own datasheet, that's not going to matter too much. He doesn't have sustained or lethal hits built in, but between Righteous Crusaders and maybe the addition of a Castellan or Lieutenant if you're feeling spendy, that means that you could be getting, say, auto wounds on a 5+ for every attack that lands, and if you wanted to pay 1 command point to flex into the sustained hits vow, every one of those 5+ results could be getting both a lethal hit and a sustained hit, and you could then use Oath of Moment to re-roll everything that isn't a 5 or 6, just creating a ridiculously spectacular damage spike that, as mentioned, could easily threaten to take down entire Titans in a single turn. As if that weren't enough as well, he also gets to hand out a bunch of mortal wounds at the start of the fight phase, likely either D3 or 3 mortal wounds, just to start the phase off on a good footing. It's definitely a big investment in massive amounts of damage, though it seems that most competitive lists do consider him worth it. It might be more of a question as to how much of an escort and a bodyguard that you give him. You definitely can get ridiculous amounts of damage, but it might be getting to the point where it's just overkill and he'll destroy any one thing, and stacking more bodies or more characters into his units might just be adding more damage that's not needed, and it might have been better to spend it on another threat to go after something different. Next up, for the Blood Angels, we've got Lemartes, 120 points for the Fearsome Death Company Chaplain. Well known for basically making Jump Pack Death Company, but even better, enormous flying ball of anger that can just break down anything that they're thrown at. Death Company already have fearsome stats in their own right, hitting with Power Fists that re-roll the hit rolls, and the same for their Inferno pistols as well. And Lemartes just makes them massively more savage, getting them lethal hits, which will go nicely with the +2 strength and +1 attack that they get on the charge, and also perhaps more importantly making them harder to destroy on the strike back, giving them -1 damage, so that damage 2 weapons basically get around about half as effective against them, and damage 3 weapons go down to damage 2, which means there's a good chance of passing a feel no pain against them. Between that and Armour of Contempt, they might be a bit harder to take down than people might expect. He also chips in a bit with his own melee as well, which gets all those very nice buffs. In Sons of Sanguinius, he himself is hitting at 6 attacks at strength 8, AP2 and damage 2 on the charge, all with the lethal hits and re-rolling the hit roll, so he's certainly no slouch himself. Perhaps the one criticism is that he is a bit spendy at 120 points. I've certainly seen some people taking the standard Jump Chaplain instead, as he just costs significantly less. Both the -1 damage and the lethal hits are pretty awesome buffing rules though. He's certainly still taken in plenty of competitive Blood Angels lists, and Blood Angels seem to be one of the strongest factions in the game right now. For the pick that have chosen to rank third, we're sticking with the Blood Angels as well for the Sanguinor. 140 points for the mysterious angelic saviour of the chapter, believed to be a sort of imperial demon born out of the collective will of the chapter and their yearning for their Primarch back. The Sanguinor is an interesting and very fighty lone operative, getting 8 attacks at strength 6, AP3 and damage 2, going up to 9 attacks, strength 8, AP3 and damage 2 if he gets to charge in Sons of Sanguinius, all of those with devastating wounds as well to break down some invulnerable saves. He's pretty well capable of destroying most medium infantry squads in the game in a single round of combat, and could certainly use some good value from Red Rampage to help him out against tough stuff if you wanted to have him punch up. Against a melee-focused army though, he can have a seriously nasty move. If you put him in reserve, then he can be a miraculous saviour, selecting an enemy unit that made a charge move, and then basically just arriving the Sanguinor in reserve and in melee within that unit, and with his fights first that means he'll be able to attack them before they get to attack, and potentially flip a combat on its head, destroying a powerful enemy melee unit before they get to destroy one of your things, or at least taking such a chunk out of them that they don't manage to destroy the unit that they'd set their sights on. That could be such an enormous power move if it goes off against the right thing, and could make your opponent second guess charges that otherwise would have been a no-brainer. From there he can just be an annoying to deal with lone operative with a bunch of wounds and a good invulnerable save, flying around the board and doing secondaries and destroying smaller units. It's just going to be a tricky model to catch up with a whole load of threats. Again, he's pretty much a staple in quite a lot of top performing Blood Angels lists. Moving on, in second place I've chosen to rank the chapter master of the Ultramarines, Marneus Calgar himself, generally the bloke that's been carrying the vast majority of core Space Marine armies to victories when they get them. With him and his Victrix Honor Guard, you can make a massive power unit that's got a lot of good advantages and a good focus for any detachment, stratagems or synergies, while also rustling you up command points turn on turn. To start with, Calgar's stats really aren't too bad. 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 with twin linked will be a threat to just about anything. And included in that 185 points cost are 2 Victrix Honor Guards who get 5 attacks each with their power swords. So a big flurry of 10 attacks at strength 5, AP 2, damage 2 is a very nice to whittle down any bigger enemy units. Those Victrix Guards are really quite tough as well, getting a 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ save at base, so it can make them an interesting tanking option for the squad that they're attached to. If you use Armour of Contempt, then that 2+ save goes a lot further. The invulnerable save could be used to catch big melter or big anti-tank weapons, and it means that you could opt to use them to tank damage on things like, say, company heroes or an aggressor unit, both of which Calgar can attach to. The mix of defensive profiles in the unit can make them just a bit more robust and hard to deal with. Otherwise, Calgar does generate 1 command point per turn, and that's generally worth a good chunk of points in itself. Means that you could be burning through some secondaries early and try and score them a bit more, or plug them into any detachment type things. And in himself, he allows you to advance, shoot and charge, and also fall back, shoot and charge, so basically all the benefits of the Gladius doctrines rolled into one and on all the time. With him and his Victrix Guard, he can be just plugged into all sorts of scary Space Marine units. Aggressors are a fairly popular one. People have used him in Vanguard Spearhead before with a bunch of aggressors and apothecary biologists to allow infiltrate, so you've got an absolutely terrifying and fairly tanky damage dealing threat in the midboard right from turn 1. Or maybe attaching to Blade Guard with a Primaris Lieutenant in tow, perhaps delivering the entire combo out of a Land Raider, or even things like Company Heroes, giving you a pretty tanky unit with the option to take big high AP things on the Victrix Guards, and they also get the -1 to wound built in from that squad, and it's fairly cheap given how cheap the Company Heroes unit is. Overall, he's just a pretty strong all-round offering, even if he does compare a fair bit of points. Good stats in himself, but I feel like it's actually those Victrix Guards that carry a whole bunch of the value, basically making a unit into a much more bigger and more threatening one, and particularly interesting with any unit special rules. Finally, maybe not too surprising that he might be ranked first, is Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels. For 105 points, he's been an auto-include in Dark Angels lists since the start of 10th edition, rustling up you a command point per turn, which is already very valuable, giving a 4+ invulnerable save to his unit, which is great with a bunch of options, including cheap assault intercessors, making Hellblasters or Stern Guard tougher, or perhaps running with the Inner Circle companions to make them genuinely harder to take out on the strike back, and then does a nice damage dealing buff for sustained hits 1 for his unit as well. Again, all very nice for any shooting damage dealers like Hellblasters or Stern Guard. Can make assault intercessors into something a bit more scary, and the damage applies to his own fairly good melee profile as well, with a bunch of strength 6, AP 4 and damage 2 attacks, or could help the Inner Circle companions get lethal and sustained hits on 6s when they do their strike mode. Basically at 105 points, he's just undercosted for what he brings, and certainly in my mind head and shoulders above any of the other Dark Angels characters, and pretty much most of the Space Marine heroes in the game. Kind of fun that there's so many options that do seem pretty credible for him, whether it's running with a big Hellblaster unit to make them stronger, tougher and generate CP, or going for a bit more of a conservative loadout, as people often tend to do in more optimised tournament lists. Things like Assault Intercessors do tend to be quite a popular escort for him there. Then you've got a unit that's 180 points and can hold an objective, often being run as a bit of a second rank, rustling up command points for the first few turns, and then committing to midfield objectives in the later game. where for their points cost they can still be really quite a savage melee threat. Overall, between all that, I feel like he's got good arguments to be the single best Space Marine named character at the moment. Finally, before we finish, let's mention a few honourable mentions. I think both of the Salamander's characters are pretty nice, Adrax Agaton and Vulcan Hestan. Adrax is a very scary melee threat, helping say Blade Guard out of a Land Raider Redeemer wound their target really quite nicely. He's fairly cheap for his own damage 3 melee stats as well. Vulcan Hestan gives you a big boost to Flamer and Melter weapons. The 4 rerolls to wounds can be good for a bunch of units, again things like Land Raider Redeemers. Nice with Infernus Marines, or maybe even Eradicators if they happen to not have vehicle or monster targets to go against. He can be very annoying to destroy on a midfield objective as well, where he provides loads of objective control and should hold that point when he's there for a turn or two, maybe with some company heroes. Kavan Shrike's a serious contender for the Raven Guard as well. He moves fast, hits hard with those lightning claws, and gives a squad of jump intercessors or vanguard veterans sort of pseudo lone operative protection. I feel like he's certainly one of the ones I could have perhaps put in the top 8. I think he adds a lot of value for his points, and having a scary melee unit like that you can't shoot at long range is pretty nasty. For the other Space Wolves, I'd throw in a mention for Bjorn the Fell-Handed. I think he did quite well out of the command point debuff changes. Fairly happy enough to be on the front lines and ruining enemy stratagems, plus is just a big fighty character that can be quite good in Champions of Rust, maybe a bit more likely to trigger sagas and get them on the go than most. And Harold Deathwolf is another popular leader for Thunderwolves, I guess weighed up against Logan himself, and whether or not you'd want him or another Wolf Lord with their discounted stratagems. Finally, for a few more, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson himself, I think is worthy of a mention these days. He's got good melee, fights first, and some interesting buffing abilities. Now the Dark Angels have pivoted to using bunches of Deathwing Knights, often run in a Gladius detachment. He's got a lot more support on the go for him. He interacts better with terrain now, and fights first with those melee stats can just be a big problem for certain armies to try and bring down. Chaplain Grimaldus of the Black Templars I feel like maybe isn't quite at the heady height of the others, but still brings massive value to his unit, most likely in a Primaris Crusader squad, giving them all the 5+ feel no pain until it makes sense to trade out for something different. His little attendants being able to catch a big bullet that could kill a Space Marine certainly don't hurt the unit either. Finally, Grey Knights are outside of the core codex Space Marines. I'll throw in a mention for Caldor Drago here. I think there's just something just extra nice about near guaranteed enough delivery into melee for a Terminator squad. If you budget a command point reroll and use his ability, just means that there's no big worry about getting one squad into close combat exactly where it's needed, which can be a bit hit or miss if there's other units trying to do so with their teleport assault type tricks. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. I know there's plenty of other good Space Marine characters out there, though I'm not talking about literally every single one today. Look forward to hearing how you'd rate the various Space Marine epic heroes. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. I'm sure there'll be plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.